Good evening, everyone, or at least everyone in Wisconsin. If you are somewhere else, then good morning or good night. Thank you for joining our conversation on the future of plastics. I'm Paul Robbins. I'm Dean of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And tonight's lecture, it's not really a lecture, it's a panel discussion, is the fourth in our Sustainable Success lecture series, which we hold in partnership with our friends and colleagues at the Wisconsin School of Business. Our engagement with the Grainger Center for Supply Chain Management, specifically within that unit, is part of our larger initiative to better connect and illustrate the Nelson Institute, but really UW's environmental science, research, and scholarship, and its innovative work to and with corporations and individuals working in the private sector. Now, given our shared visions, the Nelson Institute and the Grainger Center for Supply Chain Management have made a really good team. Just a shout out to Grainger. I'd like to take that opportunity now then to introduce Jake Dean, who's director of the Grainger Center for Supply Chain Management. And it says right there that he has to wave. So do you already waved?
I had advance notice.
Excellent. We've also teamed up with Andrea Hicks, who for me is on the right, who is assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And Andrea is also the Hansen Family Fellow in Sustainability, a distinction that's made possible by the generosity of the Hansen Family Fund for Sustainability. And she's the director of the Sustainability Research and Education Unit within the UW's Office of Sustainability. So our sustainability on campus is predicated on the notion that making the campus cleaner and greener is linked to the research and education that goes on with our faculty and our students. Andrea runs the latter half. Andrea's been a huge addition to the team, and we want to thank her for addressing sustainability topics here at the Nelson Institute and at UW. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the Nelson Institute Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment Weston Roundtable series. This is a partner for tonight's series and has helped make sure that this is possible. And lastly, and before we get to the main event, I want to acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the land where I'm sitting, which is on the west side of town, but still here in Madison, is located and occupies Ho-Chunk land, a nation that has called this place Dejope since time immemorial. And in an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, land that they had stewarded for thousands of years and which remain a vital part of their identity and heritage. We encourage everybody to learn more about the land where you live and you work and the history of that land in a way that can inform our shared future with the indigenous communities here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. All right, tonight we're going to talk about plastic. So plastics and recycling. Plastics have become a ubiquitous part of life. That seems like, I don't know what to say about that. Like, I'm from the 1970s. With plastics, I can't remember a time without plastics. But plastic recycling can be expensive and difficult, and changes have been made really recently in innovation. And so we wanted to really talk about what's next for plastics. Over the last 50 years, a lot of plastic is lingering in landfills, breaking down into microplastics in the oceans, which is a big news story. So tonight, we've got an exceptional group of speakers to discuss how businesses are thinking about plastics, the state of recycling plastics, and what technology is being explored to improve plastics recycling. And I just read this. This is from April of 2020 in Nature, which is about actually engineering enzymes to better break down plastics in the recycling process to close the loop in the cycle in a way that's both more efficient and more sustainable. So stuff's happening, and we have the right people here to talk about it. So to help us, we're fortunate to have Carolyn Woznicki, Chief Procurement Officer at Illinois Toolworks. You will see her. I believe we're all seeing the same screen in the bottom left. Steve Alexander, President and CEO at the Association of Plastic Recyclers. And George Huber, who is the Richard L. Antoine Professor in the UW Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering and lead at the Center on Chemical Upcycling of Waste Plastics. Okay, so here's the plan. I'm going to shut up. It's to start having each of these speakers provide a short opening set of remarks about their background related to plastics and recycling, what's on their mind, what's keeping them up at night, where this is going. And then Jake, Andrea, and I are going to ask a couple of questions that we've prepared to kind of spark some discussion in the groups. And lastly, we'll take questions from the audience. So as you're listening to our guests, just type your questions into the Q&A and the comments, and that will be curated and I will convey them back to the group. I think the most important thing here is that if you've got questions, you've got smart, super smart people who can respond to them. And we will do that live here on YouTube. So we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time we've got. And let's start off by hearing from Caroline, I think.
All right, Paul, thanks for that introduction. My name is Carolyn Woznicki, and I work at Illinois Toolworks, which is headquartered in Glenview, Illinois. We're about a $12.8 billion multi-industrial company. So we make things. We make things out of plastic, as well as steel, electronics, other things. But plastic is for sure on our mind in terms of how can we be a good corporate citizen, and how can we continue to use less and recycle and find opportunities for us to consume recycled plastics at Illinois Toolworks. And just to frame this for people that are on the phone call, some things that you might recognize that are made out of plastic that ITW has perhaps something to do with is the six-pack rings. One of our divisions makes the plastic six-pack rings that many of us, carry home our soda in, or beer, or maybe another beverage. We make Miller welding equipment, and certainly within that equipment are some plastic parts. Maybe you won't see those, but inside there's probably some structural parts. We're a very large manufacturer that serves the automotive industry, and we make a variety of plastic fasteners. And we also make a variety of other plastic component parts that are used in various places on those vehicles. And so you see a lot of places where plastic is consumed. And actually, I want to mention maybe one more place, and that is the zipper that you would see on a Ziploc bag. ITW actually invented that product many, many years ago. The patent has expired, so there are other companies that actually make those zippers, but we still make zippers that we provide to a variety of packaging companies who might put packaged cheese or other things in it. So we have a long history of using plastics. We buy more than $500 million worth of plastics, and that is in many different grades and types. And from many different suppliers. And we also buy recycled plastic. As I mentioned, one of our goals is to do the best that we can environmentally. And so we're constantly looking for ways to improve that and improve the utilization of recycled products where we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carolyn. Steve, maybe we can hear from you next. By the way, I love that zipper. I can't imagine.
Great product.
I can't imagine my life without it. So there you go. Steve?
Steve, you're on mute.
That helps, which most people know it's very hard to mute me. My name is Steve Alexander, and I run the Association of Plastic Recyclers. And let me be very clear, that is not the plastics industry. We are the international trade organization that is the sustainability solution to plastics packaging. Absent federal guidelines, we are the technical soul and the technical solution provider to the plastics recycling industry. We have what is arguably the world's foremost authoritative reference guide for consumer brand companies to design their package for recyclability. It's called the APR Design Guide, Plastics recyclability, it's been translated into Chinese, it's been translated into Spanish, it's used across the globe by major consumer brand companies. If there's a product or an innovation that contaminates a package that inhibits its ability to be recycled, we're the people that try and solve that problem. We have testing protocols where you can bring a package innovation to us and test it for its compatibility. We take our design guide training program, we customize it for consumer product companies and others who are looking to bring their package into the marketplace to ensure it's recyclable. We have long been a very staunch advocate for things like mandated recycled content requirements across the board. We believe that, frankly, unless there's a guaranteed market in the marketplace for material, all we're doing with all our efforts is we're simply collecting, sorting, and processing trash. And no one runs a business that way, to be quite frank. If you think about the way the system works, you put material in the bin, it flows to the system one way, but the monetization of that system either happens from the end back, or consumers end up paying for it through their taxes and their waste hauling fees, et cetera. So there's a cost to recycling, and we have to make sure that we understand who, in fact, imposes that cost on the constituents. So we are all things plastics recycling. We're very excited, frankly, about the media attention and the quote-unquote crisis that we're in right now for one reason. We've been trying to get people to pay attention to the recycling of plastics for 32 years. And so now, finally, people are listening to us. This morning, I was on a global panel discussing this issue with National Geographic and the United Nations. I'm a big participant in something called the United States Plastic Pact, which is the United States management platform for all those consumer brand companies that have signed on to the Ellen MacArthur Global Plastics Commitment, where they are requiring themselves to meet a 25% recycled content standard by 2025. The key to that versus everything else that's happened over the years in terms of these, what I call halo announcements by brand companies that say they're going to do something, then it just falls by the wayside, is for the first time, these requirements and these metrics are going to be transparent, and they're going to be accountable, and they have to report every year. And so by 2025, there has to be a pathway to 25% recycled content in major consumer product company packaging, or at least a 25% recycling rate. So we're excited about that, and we're leading that effort as well. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to have a good evening. George, are you up?
Yeah, can you hear me, Paul?
Sure can. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. So my name is George Huber, and I'm kind of a newcomer to the whole plastic recycling industry. I'm a chemical engineer, and I'm the director of a new $12.5 million center that's funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, where we're looking at developing new technologies for recycling waste plastics using chemical engineering principles. I'll tell you a little bit about our center. Our center involves 7 different universities, 4 in the United States, 2 in Mexico, 1 in Canada. So we're truly North and South America center. We have a national lab, an industry association involved, the Plastics Industry Association, 8 companies all throughout the plastic value chain are involved with us to try and develop new technologies. The challenge today is there are plastics that can be recycled today, but the amount of plastics that's recycled today is very small because the technology primarily relies on mechanical recycling, which doesn't work with a lot of plastic materials because plastics are so complex chemically. So we're developing new technologies that will allow us to be able to recycle a wider variety of plastics, mixed plastic streams, and go back to virgin plastic polymers. One technology we're working with is with a company called Amcor that's Neenah, Wisconsin. They're the largest manufacturer of multi-layer films. These are used all the time in the food industry and food packaging. When you go to your grocery store, most of your plastic packaging comes in these multi-layer films, and you can't recycle these with mechanical recycling. So we've worked with them to develop technologies to use different solvents and selectively remove the polymers from the multi-layer films, and then you can go back and reuse them like you would a virgin polymer. So thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk more about this.
And we are going to have a chance to get back to everybody. So now I'm going to give a few curated questions from Jake, Andrea, and then me, to which each of our panelists can reply. And then for those of you who have questions, just make sure you just channel them in there in the chat, and our staff will bring them to me, and I can bring them to the people on deck here. You're not going to get a livelier group than these three. This one's good. So let's start with Jake. Go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned in his earlier remarks, plastic is everywhere. We're surrounded by plastic. I can see a ton of plastic even where I'm sitting right now. So maybe Steve, I'll start with you. Can you give us, those of us who don't know too much about it, just a general sense of the categories or types of plastic that are out there and the uses for those, and then sort of the life cycle options that exist currently for those?
Well, the primary resins that people are aware of, and that's an important point because one plastic is different than the other as glass is from aluminum. So, you just can't mix them together. By and large, so the most iconic plastic is polyethylene terephthalate, PET. That's number one. Think of a soda bottle. High density polyethylene, which is number two in your lineup, and that's mostly your bathroom, laundry detergent, kitchen items. Think of laundry detergents, hardcore. Then you have basically polypropylene, which tends to be like butter tubs, yogurt tubs, some clamshell apparatus. Then of course you have number four is low density polyethylene, mostly film and flexible type material. Polystyrene is number six. PVC is number three, but that's very, very seldom used in consumer packaging these days. It's not something that we see. The most recyclable material at this point, obviously you have the PET industry, which is the number one plastic. A lot of deposit programs, there are 10 of them left in the United States. And then that infrastructure was started because of the deposit program. Number two, high density polyethylene. That was basically a response to government regulation in 1995 in California. Polypropylene recycling is basically something that was started by us back in 2012 when our economic models have always shown that you need between 350 and 400 million pounds of good, clean material on an annual basis in the United States to support a collection infrastructure that would make it economically sustainable. We've been getting a lot of questions from some of our recyclers because they had this material left over and they said, look, can we find a market for this? Excuse me. So we did a survey of the largest brand companies in the world, and just 12 of them got back to us, but said they would use 1 billion pounds of recycled polypropylene on an annual basis. So that gave us the footprint that we could then go back to the capital markets and say, look, if we can make an investment for additional processing capacity, we can generate enough. We have a market demand to purchase that material. And so in 8 short years, without government mandate, there's now about 350 million pounds of recycled polypropylene out in the marketplace out there today. All your paint buckets are made with recycled material. Most of your carpeting is made with recycled soda bottles. I could go on and on, but I hope that gives you some semblance of where we are.
Yeah, I think that's a good level set for us in the audience here.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm going to bring Sean Welch in a moment, but I think Jake's question, I'd like to hear from Caroline and George about their thinking about the complexity and differentiation in the market, how it's handled in the business community. Caroline, do you have any answers to Jake's question before I move to Sean?
Yeah, I think that the focus on the recycled industry, continues to grow because companies like ITW want to be a responsible corporate citizen, and we want to reduce the impact on the environment. What I see from a sourcing perspective is that we don't have enough infrastructure yet to provide ready, if you will, able to use recycled material. We'd like to buy more. Right. We'd like to buy more to consume it in our products, and we can't necessarily find those sources. So building the infrastructure to recycle the plastics is incredibly important.
That's great. George, any thoughts on Jake's question?
Yeah, no, I think these responses are great. Steve mentioned the 6 types of plastics. There's a lot more than 6 types of plastics that are used in industry, and just the whole complexity of plastics is very complex. There's so many different types of it, and there's so many applications they're used for. It's not like glass, where you primarily have 2 different types of. You think about recycling glass, there's 2 main types. You just heat it up, you melt it down, and you can recycle the glass. Recycling plastics is a lot more complex. And then the other point I'd like to build on with Steve is all of these technologies depend on doing them on larger volumes. The larger the volume you have, the cheaper and the more economical it becomes. So you need to get to certain volumes with plastics for these technologies to work. And it's challenging because with plastics, the whole industry has made them so you use less and less of them, and you can go to light weighting of the plastic. So you really do need to develop that whole supply chain and understand the different chemistry and the composition of the plastics you're dealing with.
Excellent. So I'm going to bring in Sean Welch now, and I'm going to let Sean introduce himself and say hello and give a little bit of background on where they are in the world of plastics. Sean, we're in the middle of some Q&A from the panel, and then we're going to go to the audience, but you've got some time to talk a little bit about how you got into this and where your thinking is. And thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I have to apologize for the delay here. You asked the question, how did I get here? And I'm kind of thinking about that right now in terms of how did I end up not being able to get on this event, which I'm very, very anxious to be a part of. So thank you for allowing me to come in. I will tell you that today was the first day I've traveled since the pandemic. And so I'm now in one of our divisions. The division has a firewall that I can't get through. So I apologize for that, but I'm on my phone. I got some options here. And so I'm happy to join this prestigious group. I am the group president for the packaging platform at ITW. I got here because Carolyn asked me to come join as a part of this, but mostly due to the work that I've been leading with my team with one of the divisions at Hycone at ITW called Hycone, which makes multi-pack solutions for the global market. And the work we've been doing around sustainability has been really the keystone to our strategy going forward with the introduction of post-consumer recycled content and other initiatives that we're driving. So I'm happy to talk through that. And I heard Steve talking about the complexities associated with recycling, the fact that now it's a part of, it's top of mind now. And so this is a great time to have this conversation. So thanks for having me. Look forward to the balance of the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sean. Do you want to take a shot at Jake Dean's question? I believe Jake's question, can you reiterate it I
can give it again. Yeah, it's just essentially for those of us in the audience who aren't as familiar with the plastic landscape, just the overall categories and types and what the life cycle options are for those.
Yeah, so I heard Steve, he was right there, maybe 6 classifications, but literally there are thousands of compounds that come from plastics. In fact, thousands of compounds turn into millions of applications. And enormous uses. So it's all around us, and I'm sure you have had that conversation. Really, the life cycle of those compounds vary. It just really depends on it depends on the use of it, and more importantly, the infrastructure associated with the end of life of those products, right? And so, we can. It's hard to answer that question because I think we were talking about it before. Is the need for the infrastructure associated with, and I think that will come because now. You have firms like us who are looking for, and as Carolyn mentioned, we'll want to buy more of recycled content. And with that market comes the market for monetization. Folks like Steve can make some money on it, and we'd be happy to spend it with him to get that content. And so, there's a lot of discussion out in the marketplace about the longevity of plastic, the life cycle, and again. As I mentioned, it's not going anywhere. It's all around us in millions of different applications, and so it's really more about how we manage it end of use. infrastructure-wise, habits, understanding, education, and bringing it back. And we think that's the best solution for plastics over the long term.
Thanks.
Super helpful. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Dr. Andrea Hicks now. She's got a question for the panel.
Great, and thank you all for being here and sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. My question is, the science around microplastics, those pieces of plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in length, is emerging still. How does this influence your thoughts on the environmental implications of plastic usage?
And we can take that in turn, but maybe we take it in the same round. Let's start with Caroline.
Yeah, so I'm for sure not an expert on microplastics, but what I can say is that if we can keep plastic from getting into the environment and then having it decompose and creating microplastics, that's kind of the magic, right? So there needs to be infrastructure and enough commercial incentive for consumers like myself and probably like everybody that's on this call. How do we return the plastic products into a place where they can be recycled? You know, there are some states that still have bottle return laws. And so the percent of recycling that happens with bottles, plastic bottles in particular, that can be returnable, you know, it's huge, right? Even people that throw them out their window, somebody will go by and pick it up because they want that nickel or that dime. And so this whole aspect of how do we prevent plastic from getting into the environment in the first place so that it doesn't get turned into microplastics is just incredibly important. I think we have to start with that.
That's hugely helpful. We'll go to Steve, then George, then Sean. Steve?
Well, thank you. Professor, I'd like to answer that in a couple of ways. You know, chemical recycling has been around since 1925. It's not that new. And I know the professors Professor Hunter now has a lot of DOE money. We've been involved with that. And I think that gets into an infrastructure play that we're finally recognizing, because mechanical recycling, traditional mechanical recycling, in a consumer standpoint, is really in its embryonic stages. And you might say to me, what are you talking about? Well, this infrastructure wasn't created until the 70s because of deposit laws for PET recycling. And that infrastructure hasn't changed all that much since the 80s. And if you think about how you purchase packaging today and the evolving waste stream that we have, when we talk about plastics recycling and the ability to capture material in the infrastructure we have available to us, it's like trying to ask my 1978 Chevy Chevette, which for some of you don't remember that, but trust me, it was a vehicle called the Chevy Chevette in 1978, to meet current California emission standards. The infrastructure, it's not people say recycling's broken. It's not recycling. It's our infrastructure. I can tell you, our recyclers operate at about 60% capacity. We would love to be able to get our hands on more material to sell to Sean and to Carolyn and the rest of the world. When California last year said, we're going to put forth a 25% recycled content rate requirement for PET containers, they think soda bottle resin, in 2025, and then by 2030, we want a 75% rate. Well, we did an analysis for them and we said, you're only collecting enough material for us to process right now. We might be able to reach 25% recycled content by 2030, but there's no way we're going to get there by 2025. We don't collect enough material, number one, to meet the demands of the marketplace. Then our sortation system has difficulty sorting the evolving ton. You think about the packaging stream today. When Professor Huber talks about multi-layer packaging, absolutely, that is a sortation problem, and we need a separate stream of material. Hopefully his chemical upcycling activity will solve that problem. But between 2010 and 2015, all the contamination in the stream of the recycling stream was not from typical contamination of rocks and dirt and what have you, okay? It was from packaging innovation by brand companies who were introducing new innovation that replaced historically recyclable packaging. So the yield for a recycler has been dropping from the bale of material they purchase dramatically. So you think about that multi-layer package, that multi-layer pouch. What did it replace? It replaced Charlie the tuna in a can of perfectly recyclable packaging. So there has to be some recognition by the brand companies at one end about the impact of their design in terms of what they're doing to the stream. And Professor Hicks, this gets to your point, because at the end of the day, we have to be able to capture more material, process it better, and capture that discarded microbead before it gets into the water stream and the marine environment. That's the biggest issue we have. So it's all, they talk about the circular economy. This is all circularly related. And there's just not one silver bullet out there that we can say this is going to solve the issue. It's really a multifaceted thing across the United States. And I'm sorry I talked so long, but you can blame ITW, because ITW was the one that hired me to do this job back in 2006 to start the plastics recycling organization. They don't know that, but those are the people that did it.
Well, that's the circular economy. We'll move to George and Sean here in just a minute, but I just want to say I've totally changed the question I'm going to ask. George?
Okay, hi. Yeah, I'm going back to Andrea's question about microplastics. It's been estimated by the MacArthur Foundation that 1/3 of plastics that are generated end up in the ocean. So to me, that's, kind of scary. And they project that in the next 20, 30 years, we'll have more plastics in the ocean than we will fish. So we really need to do something about changing that infrastructure. It's a huge liability to everybody in the whole plastic value chain who uses plastics. Most of the plastics that do end up in the ocean come from Asia, where they have different laws and they don't really have the infrastructure to collect the waste plastics. But then we ship a lot of our plastics and our waste materials to Asia. So I think it's a huge concern that we need to deal with, and we really need to develop that infrastructure and start putting in the funds to develop the supply chain to collect the plastics and process it.
All right, Sean, you want to follow up? And I may ask something, but we got a lot of questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, listen, I was listening to Steve and I forgot the question because he was going. And so I appreciate where he was coming from. The microplastics is a concern. It's no question about that, to the statistics that were cited earlier. And we like to take a path of two paths: the reuse path and the recycle path. It goes back to this whole infrastructure scenario. Steve made a great point to say that it's not a silver bullet. There's multiple paths that you can go in, but ultimately it has to be an industry-wide, along with consumers, municipalities, legalities, and the manufacturers to understand this situation and that we're actually contributing to this waste in the environment. We talk about at ITW these 3 R's. We like to say is recover, recycle, and reuse. And through our innovation process, we're looking at ways that we can actually look at material science that actually take microplastics out. And in doing so, we believe that perhaps that will prohibit some of the microplastics. Having said that, the only thing that's really going to do it in totality is the infrastructure and the recovery. If you think about microplastics are contributing to the ocean debris through clothing, polyesters that are in your clothes that actually you wash and you send, and nobody knows that, or not many people know that, and I'm sure some people know that. But that is, so that the problem is pervasive, and so what we're trying to do again is, make sure that there's an infrastructure for end of use to bring that back. The 55% post-consumer recycled content that we currently market. Think about that. That takes half of the plastic that could potentially end up in waste streams out of the waste stream back into use. That's the idea. And oh, by the way, the life cycle analysis on that versus other alternatives that may be perceived as being a solution are actually have unintended consequences of actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And so the activity around banning or canceling, if you will, won't make it go away either. And so we're trying to make sure that, one, we recover, and then in those situations where we can't recover it, it ends up in the waste stream, that we have materials that biodegrade or compost that are not harmful to the environment. And so that's the totality of what we're trying to accomplish. But again, I can't understate the importance of the infrastructure, end of use management, to keep things from getting in places that they're unintended.
This is, I don't know, if people listening aren't having their mind blown, then they're not me. I'm supposed to ask a different question than I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to go to the audience. I'm going to ask a different question. So can the market sort this out? Or what is the one piece? Let me put it another way. What's the one simplest, least invasive piece of regulation that if you could wave a wand and regulate one little piece, not, like, oh, everything must be this way, just one little piece that could capture this stream? Because what I hear from the four of you is the biggest problem is that you just can't get your arms around it. There's too much leakage. It's everywhere. It gets out. How and whether you would regulate any part of this stream? And I just take it in order. Caroline, would you like to take that on?
Sure. So I used to live in Michigan, and we were talking before the call started about their bottle return law, which has been in place for decades. And it's a 10-cent deposit when you buy something that's in a plastic bottle. And so there is a commercial incentive for me as a consumer to bring that bottle back to the store. And I did every time. So if I was thinking about legislation more broadly and, how to incentivize consumers to bring plastic back, it would have something to do with a deposit. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but, a deposit on a per pound basis or on a per, something basis. But there needs to be a commercial incentive that gets consumers to bring it back. You don't want consumers to put it in their garbage can or throw it on the side of the road, right? So for me, I would start with that. And then the recyclers would have sufficient stream coming into them to be able to justify the infrastructure that's come up several times in our conversation. But that's where I would start.
Thanks. That's super helpful. Steve, George, and Sean, leading on that, what about also other parts of the stream, the waste stream?
Well, we like to keep it very simple and very straightforward. We think mandated recycled content requirements for brand companies will create a market, and it will incentivize companies to purchase recycled content, which then increases the amount of monetization in the system, which, in my opinion, takes care of itself. Because the consumer brand companies who spend billions telling us what to do will then have an incentive to communicate to their consumers, you need to bring this material back. We need it recycled because we need it to meet these recycled content requirements. So to us, a very simple, straightforward legislative policy driver is mandated recycled content in packaging.
Thanks, Steve. George?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. The other aspect of this question that I think is important is dealing with waste management companies. And right now, they're incentivized primarily to landfill their waste. So if you can increase the tipping fees and decrease the amount of plastic content that are in those waste companies, that could increase the amount of plastics that goes to these other technologies. So I think that's another important thing. In Wisconsin, there's really only 2 plastics we're not allowed to landfill. That's number 1 and 2 rigid plastics. So most of the recycling, I think most people don't understand this. In the state of Wisconsin, most of your stuff you put in the recycling, the only stuff that gets recycled is stuff that's rigid and has number 1 and 2 on it. Everything else you put into the recycling bin, the plastic bags, everything like that goes to landfill. And occasionally some of the MRFs will take out the polypropylene. And there's technology to do this, like Steve said. We just haven't put the legislation in place and given the companies the right economic incentive to do this.
That's helpful. At least I get 2 bins for garbage. All right, Sean.
Yeah, so to be political, I'm going to take all those ideas and put them in one bill. All right, so so I think they're pretty good, right? I think we definitely have to mandate recycled content. I think we need to incentivize consumers, and I think we need to certainly bolster the recyclers, waste management, incentivize infrastructure around that to make it work. I know from our procurement efforts around trying to find recycled content is very difficult. But now that we've committed to it, we now have partners that can commit to going to get that product for us and keep making it available. As you do more of that, manufacturers are going to want to spend for that particular valued raw material. Right now, it's not valued. And if it's not valued, then folks like Steve don't have an incentive to sort it or invest in the sorting capabilities. And I believe that if we can send ships to the moon, we can figure out how to sort out flexible plastics in our recycling systems. I mean, it's available. We just need to incentivize that. So, money for the recyclers, mandates for manufacturers for post-consumer recycled content, and incentives for consumers. We wrap that all in a bill and see if we can't get that passed to the House and the Senate, and celebrate that.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to leave some opportunity for Jake and Andrea to come back in. We have so much knowledge in them that I want to leave them for questions, but we need to go to the audience so that so we can get out on time. What about reuse? So reuse, recycle. Is recycling now just reuse? Is reuse done? Is efficiency increasing in plastics consumption and life cycling driving away reuse? What's the role of reuse? And let's go into the lightning round because we got like 5 questions. Caroline?
So I think where you can reuse things, that's the most efficient way. I just think functionally, it's hard to find products that can be reused without sort of creating new pellets of resin that you then reprocess.
Thanks, Steve.
Consumer behavior. I think reuse is a viable option for certain applications, and I think it's just getting to change consumer behavior. I absolutely think it's appropriate.
George?
Yeah, if you're talking about reuse, like mechanical recycling, the challenge is your properties degrade with time, and you reach a limit about how much recycled content you can get in the product. I work with companies like Suntory, and they're already at that limit, 75%. One advantage of our technologies we're working on our center is you get to remake the virgin polymer, and you can reuse in the same application that you use in the original PET or polypropylene or PE.
Sean, please.
Yes, so it would depend on the application, right? I mean, you've seen through recent times through COVID where there's a heightened awareness to food and hygiene, and so I think the consumers from that standpoint, at least when it comes to plastic, may not be necessarily looking to reuse form to form, but certainly in other cases it's possible. So where we can, I think we should certainly recycle it.
Thank you, Sean. I haven't touched anything out of this basement in almost 1 year. All right, so let's go to another question from the audience. It's been touched on already, but what's happening in production, at the front end of production, to make things more or less recyclable? Because we hear a lot of critiques, this is maybe not in plastic so much, of electronics, that the planned obsolescence actually makes them less recyclable than more recyclable. What's happening in the front end of production? Caroline?
So we touched on it briefly, but there are lots of things that are added to plastics by brand companies and others to make them look cool. Even for structural or functional parts, glass is often added to make it more structurally sound. And so that complicates recycling a little bit. If you look at some packaging, sometimes there's a foil attached to packaging, to give it a pretty colorful view. And those things that appeal to us visually often make it more complex to recycle.
Steve, go ahead.
Well, the design, I think, is what is critical, and there's a growing recognition that when you're going to design a package, a label, a closure, it has to be compatible with recycling, and that is all recycling starts with design. So that's the important thing.
George?
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to this is that there's new types of plastics that are coming online or have been developed that are biodegradable. So if they do leak into the environment, they'll biodegrade, like PLA, PBAT, PHA. These are smaller volume plastics. Sometimes they don't have the properties of your other plastics, but that's another option people are looking at.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean, please.
Yes, I would tell you that that's an odd question for me, because at Hycone we reuse and reuse everything. So, but I would tell you that, to Carolyn's point, I mean, what we've seen and what we've resisted is the added additions of color or other additives that would prohibit us from being able to reuse it, right? And so you add color to it, it's another set of complications potentially for even our reuse. So anything that you add for cosmetics and or other functionality could be a prohibitor for it.
Yep.
Let me riff on that for a minute, totally wildly. We had Johnson Controls in here talking about battery life cycle. They've done a really good job of closing their pretty good job anyway, if I believe them, in closing their cycle. And I think that they're incentivized at the production end for recyclability because they are forced to take it back in. In other words, they who produce must consume. I don't know if that's a regulatory thing or if it's something that's built into the market, but
Hey, Paul, if I can jump in there, it's built into the market. There's not a requirement that we bring our battery back, right? But again, there's a commercial incentive because anybody that buys a car battery, you will get a core deposit back if you bring the old one in. And that varies. I think it's $20 to $40 depending on how big the battery is. But as a consumer, you bring your battery back because you don't want that hunk sitting in your garage and somebody's going to pay you for it. So that commercial incentive for the consumer exists, and it's enough that it makes us want to bring it in. So that product is highly recyclable. And to Johnson Controls, I guess I'll say this because I know a little bit about it. It's a win-win situation, right? Because it gets the polypropylene that is in a battery case back to them where they can reuse it. And it allows the lead that's in a traditional lead acid battery to get back to them so they can reuse it. Both products are highly, highly recyclable.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I assume, again, coming back to the earlier question, that their need to reconsume the materials comes into some front-end decisions in production, which cause an ease of that metabolism. In other words, right? They make decisions at the front end.
Yeah. Frankly, again, it's commercially less expensive to be able to buy recycled material than it is to buy virgin. So just think about lead, right? If somebody has to go mine lead and purify it and get it into an ingot, that's pretty complicated. But if you can take lead that's already been through that process and it's in a lead acid battery and then reclaim it, it's a lower cost process. So, it's a win-win for everybody involved. And the same thing is true for plastics, right? We're using that as an analogy, but the same thing, I think is true for plastics, where plastics can be recycled.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to Jake and Andrea in a minute so they can chip in a question, but we got one more from the audience, and it's sort of visionary or aspirational. 5 years, 10 years from now, like, what do you see happening in this metabolic system? And we'll go backwards. Sean, you want to start?
So yes, we have a vision as well, looking a little bit less than 5 years. So by 2025, we're seeing a world where there is recycled content in our products and others. A world where there's recyclers who are busy working on providing this valuable raw material back into the system. and then in situation and a educated consumer base that is very active in understanding their role in making sure that end of life gets appropriately managed. And so, and in the event that neither one of those things are happening and product gets out into the environment, that we have materials that will be will be compostable or biodegradable or not harm the environment. And so we'd like to see less litter, of course, more product going back into the system, circular.
So just to clarify on that, because we do have an audience question, what should consumers be doing, Sean? If you had to just give them 3 bullet points, what should they be doing?
I think they should be reading, certainly reading the packages themselves. Most times there is instruction around how to recycle, but again, it's very, very hard to understand. Sometimes, again, 6 different numbers. Who goes what municipality is actually accepting that particular number is very difficult. We've done some research to say that that consumers who are educated will actually recycle. Don't know how. And so it's the education around how to recycle, where to recycle, and back to Carolyn's point, an incentive will certainly be helpful, right? I think we do things that we get incentivized for the most part. That would be my answer.
Thank you, George. 5 to 10 years from now, and aspirational. Where are we?
Yeah, well, I hope we don't have any plastics leaking into the environment, and we've kind of got that infrastructure in place to collect all the plastics. I think we'll improve the mechanical recycling. That's the cheapest and low-cost technology to get plastics back into the industry. And then we'll have technologies that will take those plastics that can't be recycled, those mixtures of things that are contaminated, that they'll involve thermal treatment of the plastics, and then you'll make an oil out of those plastics, and then the companies that make the plastics today will be feeding in the oil from petroleum and then oil from plastics, and they'll be remaking the plastics themselves from chemical recycling of those waste plastics.
That sounds nice. Steve?
It's happening. It's happening.
I know. I read Nature. Go, Steve.
There are 20,000 communities in this country, 15,000 recycling programs, 9,000 of them take different things. 5 years from now, there's going to be more consistency across what communities take for recycling. Today, only 50% of the population of the United States has access to a recycling program. So in 5 years from now, there'll be a lot more people who have access to programs, which means more material. And the other thing, of course, is so you got access. The other thing is you'll have labeling will be much more consistent and concise and instructive to stop the amount of contamination going into the stream.
Yeah, I've got a great big bin, and half of what I'm putting in there isn't going to get recycled. That's what I've learned tonight. Caroline?
So if I think about 5 years from now, I think that there will be continued legislation in this space. First of all, we're seeing it all over the place globally. That creates some kind of an incentive for companies to use more recycled content or to reduce it. In some cases, I think municipalities are even thinking about passing legislation that, stops, things like single-use plastic containers, cups, forks, spoons, knives, etc. Right? So we'll see more legislation in that. We're very conscious of that. If I think 5 years from now as well, I think companies will continue to look at ways to reduce their own use of plastic so that we can reduce the impact on the environment. And I think that on that design aspect that came up, that companies will continue to be more thoughtful about the design at the front end so that the recycling at the back end can be more easily occurred.
That's great. We are bombarded by, I want you to know we're being bombarded by questions. On the other hand, we've got Jake Dean and Andrea Hicks here, and I think they're great. So Jake, do you have a question maybe you could toss out to the group, and then we'll get to Andrea, and then we'll have to close out.
Sure, I do. So I thought it was interesting that you all mentioned the post-consumer mandates on the production side of things. So, when you go to someone like, I'm just going to Kraft or Pepsi or something, and you say, you know what, you need 55, 60, whatever % post-consumer in your packaging. What do they tell you? Like, what's their reaction to that? Is that, yeah, great, I can do that, or that's not going to work for me for these 3 reasons? What do you get?
So the receptivity from our customer base going in has been very, very positive, right? They see it as a solution to the pervasive problem, which is litter and in a lot of cases the consumer backlash on what's going on with plastics and as it relates to ocean littering. So they see it as a solution, and they see it as being very progressive, particularly when you can provide them with life cycle analysis data that helps them with their corporate social responsibility goals. It becomes a part of the solution. So now they can get out and talk, and it could be a part of their branding. In fact, a lot of the bigger brands want to be out first and be in the marketplace with that solution. So they're very positive about it. The question they have ultimately is, do you have enough material? Can you continue to supply it and support it? And at this point, we've been able to, but we need to get more infrastructure in place so that they can actually deliver against that. And you've seen that there's been a collective in soda companies that now are talking about every bottle back. And these are competitors that are coming together to talk about PET bottles coming back in its full totality, including the caps. And so there's a lot of really, really positive discussion around it. And they want to be first. Now, there's some conversation around the color. Is it clear as it used to be? Is it a little dingy? But the other side to that, there are a lot of customers who say that cues the consumer that there's something different there, and this is natural. So it's been very positive, and they want to know how fast we can go, and when can we bring bio to play? And so
the caps. I lose my caps, for God's sake. All right. That was excellent, Sean. Thank you. I'm going to go to Andrea for one last question. You can throw it to anybody you want.
So I've really enjoyed how many times life cycle assessment has come up, because it's actually my area of research in my faculty job. And so one thing I think often isn't discussed is the relative benefits of plastic compared to some other materials when we think about the environmental impacts of transportation, due to how light it is compared to like glass. And often I think that gets a little bit muddled in the conversation about sustainability. And I was wondering if anyone might just like to make a quick comment on that.
Andrea, I'll make a quick comment on that. And I think it's a great observation, right? If we think about the 6-pack ring that ITW makes and one of the subjects of our conversations, that is an incredibly efficient way to carry 6 bottles, right? Think about the old days when there was a cardboard tray that it sat in, and sometimes shrink wrap that surrounded it as well, and how incredibly efficient it is to take a few ounces of plastic and have a very efficient way to containerize these bottles, and a very convenient way for customers to carry them, and a very easy way for trucks to be packed out, if you will. So that's a great observation. So there is a place for plastics for sure, because it provides a lot of benefit and utilization.
I'll add one thing to that, if I could. I have the benefit of having worked in the glass industry as well. So prior to joining ITW, I worked in the glass company, and one of the big issues is that while glass is endlessly recyclable, and it is probably most recycled substrate that you can actually have from its purity, endlessly recycled. The weight of it from a transportation standpoint, just from production to filling, from filling to consumer, is significantly more than any other thing, any other element of contribution to what is called greenhouse gas emissions, right? So it takes the sustainability from glass out. Think about the whole life cycle across the transportation and the supply chain. So that is a big player in the space in terms of the impact of sustainability for glass. But for plastic, as Carolyn mentions, it's very, very light. and is very strong. And it serves the purpose of moving, multiple packages of product through the supply chain from production to end of life.
We're at 6:30. I have got 1,000 questions coming in from the audience. I wanted to hear from Steve and George on that last question. We do not have time. How about we bring you all back for something? I know you're busy people, but I don't think we're done with this. And I think certainly our constituents and our students could learn more about the plastic cycle. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming in. I have a bunch of backup questions in case nobody was going to ask questions. This is something people are really, really interested in. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to hearing from the industry. Thanks to hearing from people. And everybody called for just a little regulation. Wasn't that interesting? I'd like to thank you for your time. I know you're all busy. You probably have families. My kid's upstairs. All right. Have a good evening. Thanks to the audience. Thank you from the Nelson Institute, the University of Wisconsin, and the Grainger. Jake?
The Grainger Center for Supply Chain Management.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good evening.
Hey, thanks for having us, you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.